I don't often do this on a Saturday night, you know.
All right, we have our lunch keynote here from vArmour. I'd like to introduce Marc Woolward, who's the CISO and CTO at vArmour, and he'll be speaking on addressing application resilience in today's complex dynamic environments. Thank you for joining us today, Marc.
You're welcome. Hey, everybody. Can you hear me, John?
Hear you just great.
Awesome. Okay, well, hi there from the United Kingdom. It's 6 p.m. on a Saturday evening, and we're in the middle of our first really big storm of the season. So in the middle of Storm Alex. So it's an interesting time to be doing this talk. I'm going to try and start my slides now. And John, if you could let me know if you're seeing the right, in fact, I can't even find a share screen. Here we go. Okay.
All right, that looks great.
Okay, you see the slide, just the slide, not the sorter or anything like that.
That's correct. Everything sounds good, looks good.
Awesome. Okay, well, anyway, thank you for inviting me. I believe I'm speaking to people around the Iowa and Illinois part of the world. So I think about 4,000 miles away. Yeah, it's good to be talking to you. My name's Marc Woolward. I'm CTO and CISO for vArmour. But actually, most of my career, I've been a practitioner, like most people here. So just before vArmour, I spent 16 to 17 years at Goldman Sachs, where I was a chief technology officer for networking and telecommunications, part of the cloud architecture team, and a technology fellow. So during that time, I led the network security function for several years, led network architecture, was a CTO, and actually in my final few years, I also owned an application resilience function for the European region. And it was actually during that time that I really realized that anything that you want to automate and make precise needs accurate information. The need for accurate information that has context underpins almost anything that you want to automate. And in highly dynamic cloud-based worlds, that's a given. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm also going to talk about one of the other lessons that I learned in my time at Goldman was about trust and reputation, particularly in finance and also obviously in places like healthcare. Trust and reputation are incredibly important. And for us as information security and cyber practitioners, that means, keeping control of data, protecting our customers' information. And as we always used to say at Goldman Sachs, staying off of the front cover of the Wall Street Journal. So, John, I don't know if you're still not muted. Did the slide move on okay? I just have had some bad experience with Zoom lately.
Yeah, I can see the charts on the left and the right.
Cool. Okay. So we're gonna, before we kind of get into some of the meat here, I'm gonna put this into a business kind of context. And where we are today, certainly with most of the customers that I deal with, which are in the service provider, finance and healthcare space, there's a conflict and a tension going on. And the bottom left-hand chart kind of describes that. In every competitive business now, in every marketplace, there is a requirement to innovate and get new products to market as quickly as possible. And that's enabled by APIs and by data, and you hear terms digital transformation, using clouds to, to spin up infrastructure very quickly and deliver new products to the market. And data obviously is an incredibly important part of this, and it's a double-edged sword, because data allows you to understand what your customers require, can begin to understand, what would be a successful new product, but clearly managing data in a sensible fashion, not just protecting it, but managing its life cycle effectively, is something that's very, very important. And that comes back to the trust and reputation thing. So I've been talking about innovation over on the right-hand side of that bottom left graph, but actually then we have to balance that up with all of the requirements to retain the trust and the reputation of our companies. At the very least, we need to remain compliant to the regulations within our industry. Better yet, if you take a risk-based approach, that should also address the regulatory requirements and put you in a much better posture. What we're finding is that poorly implemented regulatory controls act against the business priorities. They get in the way. Those controls can be static and manual, and these days they're ineffective, because what we see is that often the application teams will work around them. And over the course of my career, I could name a number of occasions where poorly thought out sets of controls that have been designed to meet regulatory requirements have been worked around and have been proven to be utterly ineffective. But what I'm trying to show with this graph here is, over on the far left, you've kind of got the regulatory compliance, the old world of things. If you begin to take a more proactive approach, which is around resiliency and building resiliency into not just your applications and your infrastructure, but into your controls, they become an enabler. And what we're seeing from some of the regulatory bodies, for instance, the FFIEC in the States and the Bank of England in Europe, is that they're beginning to recognize that actually resiliency is the sweet spot. As opposed to focusing on recovery, making systems and applications resilient is really the most effective approach. And when this is well implemented, these kind of controls, they provide value to the application owners, so they don't choose to work around them, and they act like the brakes on a sports car. With a resilient infrastructure and with good visibility, you can go faster. I did just mention now that actually this kind of this tension and this move to digital transformation and move to dynamic environments is now being recognized by the regulators. The FFIEC, the Bank of England, they talk a lot about resilience, continuous controls, prioritizing them controls around business functions, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The second half of this slide is designed to show that actually what's happening is the rate of change in many organizations, driven by cloud and CI/CD pipelines and continuous delivery of software, has outpaced the way in which we were doing our mapping and our analysis in a manual fashion. So things like business impact analysis and the cyber controls are now being outpaced by the rate of change. So we need to do something differently. So we've ended up with these very complex environments where not even the owners of the applications and functions really understand dependencies in a clear and accurate fashion. And what we need, if we're going to actually protect the applications and the data, is a better way of understanding, the scope of the applications throughout their entire life cycle, which includes an understanding of relationships and the risks associated with those relationships. We need to be able to ask questions about the posture of our systems and our critical functions, and be updated when risks to those critical business functions and dependencies change. or something changes within the environment to violate my policies. Okay, so this slide talks a little bit about what's changing, and the old world versus the new world. Firstly, as a kind of an information security and a cyber practice, we become very, very focused on events. You know, we have our SIMs, we have, you know, systems and cloud systems that generate massive amounts of logs, loads and loads of events, you know, millions or billions a day. And those events don't have any context. It's very, very difficult to action them. And we end up in a situation where we are today, where we're overwhelmed with data. And that actually becomes one of the problems. The second thing that's changing is, in the old world, we had numerous static controls that didn't really understand changes within the environment. So things like, you know, the static firewall policy that broke as soon as the application changed. And really what we now need is something that understands when the environment changes, what that actually means, and provides it context. So, you know, for instance, when a workload is spun up and it becomes part of an application, treat it as part of that application immediately and understand whether or not the posture and the controls are appropriate. So the graph over on the right-hand side here talks a little about the different sorts of systems and controls that we have in place. And it shows that, you know, things like the CMDB and GRC tools have been very much based in the old world, where they're based upon a static view of the world. You know, with GRC, it's often around periodic reviews of the environment, not having a real understanding of when things change within the environment. And we believe that the answer to this lies with technology that we call application relationship management. And there's a bunch of you know, there's a bunch of solutions and a bunch of technologies and products in this space. So let's take a little look at application relationship management and what it does using knowledge theory. So if you're familiar with knowledge theory, it's often called the DIKW pyramid: data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And it's a way of describing different classes of information. So what this diagram shows is two things at the starting point. First of all, we have lots of data. So at the bottom of this graph, we have the machines that generate logs in the billions a day, either from the cloud providers or from our security systems, or from applications which are actually now way better, you know, instrumented than they were a decade ago. They generate an awful lot of data. And one of the challenges there is relating that data to something that's actionable, that allows you to secure your environment. The second thing we also have is, we have at the top, we have wisdom. We have the requirements. We have our control requirements. We have our regulations. You know, we have our regulatory frameworks that provide us with guidance around how we should secure and protect certain business functions. And also you'll have things like your internal security policies, which are generally written in Word documents, which are very difficult to turn into something that's actionable, and extremely difficult to relate to the data coming from the machines at the bottom. So what we've kind of got here, there's a gap. And that gap in the old world, before we got to automation and cloud, used to be filled by humans and weeks of work. So, you know, the example is the firewall change request. The firewall change request comes in, and the human being used to go away and find out what are the systems that make up an application, what do they do, you know, what do they communicate with, is this appropriate, does it conform to the corporate security standards, and then a decision will be made and the appropriate controls will be put in place. Now, in the modern world of CI/CD and cloud, that's broken, because the human being, apart from being, you know, not 100% accurate, is too slow. So this gap is a problem. And application relationship management, it addresses that gap. So what does application relationship management do? Well, first of all, it consumes data. It consumes the telemetry from the environment and also consumes metadata from CMDBs and inventories and control planes to provide some context. The first thing it does, as we move up from data to information, is it structures it. It describes the behavior and relationship of things. In our example, it takes that data and it creates a graph which shows how systems communicate and the nature of those communications. And it allows you to understand information about how applications, clients, and users communicate with each other. So we've moved from data and from billions of events up to information represented in a kind of a graph context, in a graph format. The next step is moving from information to knowledge. And knowledge is something that begins to relate back to your business and what you're trying to achieve, your control requirements. And what you need to do to achieve that is you need context. So application relationship management contextualizes this information with metadata. What is this system? Is it part of a business function? What part of the organization is it a part of? And what are the cyber risks associated with it? So, the telemetry feed coming from your vulnerability scanners and from your SIM and everything like that, that labeled information can also be associated with those systems. So once you get to that kind of contextualized, rich view of what your applications are doing, you then end up with something. You end up with a model that can be addressed by the wisdom or the control requirements as it is normally expressed. So for instance, the PCI DSS requirements for segmentation can easily be mapped to a contextualized graph of your environment. You know what the Cat 1A assets are, the Cat 1B, et cetera, et cetera. So, for the PCI example, it allows us to determine the category of systems, label them, compute the policies that are required to protect them, apply those policies and monitor. Another example would be for business continuity management. This model allows you to identify the dependencies of a critical business function, compare their recovery time objective capabilities, which have been pulled from a GRC or from an inventory, report on the violations, and continue to do so forevermore. So when something changes, so say an RTO capability changes or a dependency changes, it will report immediately that violation has occurred. And a third example of how this can work is a software vulnerability example. So what application relationship management lets you do is it lets you identify your critical apps because they're labeled, pull the CVSS status from the vulnerability scanner, detect when critical functions have dependencies or relationships with significant vulnerabilities. So you set a threshold, high or critical, produce an alert that's actionable, and it's actionable against a critical function. So it allows you to prioritize your response, and it lets you do that continuously once again. So, what application relationship management lets you do is it lets you gather business context and join it with the relationships of the systems within your environment. And it's super powerful. It gives you so many different use cases, particularly from a cyber and operational resilience standpoint. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly about how regulation is changing. And in particular, what we've seen over the last year or two from the FFIEC and the Bank of England, they're now talking about resilience as opposed to recovery, which is a big change in focus. And that is a response to the increase in dynamism of our IT environments and our apps. And what we would expect to see is over the course of the next few years, the other regulators and certainly other sectors apart from the financial services sector will catch up with this as well. So, point one is that resilience and cyber resilience needs to be continuous. The old days of the 2-year periodic BCP test in isolation is not sufficient. things change too fast, and those periodic tests are just not realistic. The second point here is protecting and prioritizing your critical business functions. You cannot protect everything to the same level of to the same depth, and there's now a recognition that we need to prioritize the protection of the most critical business functions, and obviously apply the appropriate controls elsewhere, but there is a requirement to prioritize. Number three, the identification of interdependencies. So time and time again, what we found is that businesses focus on securing their critical function or the critical application, and their interdependencies, their downstream dependencies, have ended up being the thing that has been breached or has failed. So actually having a system that can show you your dependencies is incredibly important. Point four is about risk identification. Resilience is about having the capability to withstand events rather than responding to them and recovering from them manually. So, we've previously spent a lot of time on detection and response, and the cyber industry has spent a lot of time on threat detection and the response tools. But actually what we're seeing now, there is once again a swing back to prevention and to putting proactive controls in place. And in order to do that, you need to have a mature kind of risk identification process that you understand how to apply those proactive controls. And then finally, number five is, to build resilience, you need to change when the environment changes. So when the app changes, when your infrastructure changes, when the threat changes, your controls need to be dynamic. And again, application resilience, relationship management is designed to address that challenge. Okay, so now I'm going to talk quickly about what we do at vArmour. I didn't want to spend too long on it. This isn't a product pitch, but this gives you an idea of how a modern system in this category would help you secure your environment. So first of all, this technology is designed to protect diverse environments, the multi-cloud, where you have some legacy, physical mainframes, where you have some public cloud, where you have probably some containers, some Kubernetes services, maybe function as a service. On-premise, you've got SDN and agents. So what you need is a system that can sit across all of those and plug in to each of those environments and give you a single pane of glass and a single pane of control. So what we do is we plug in to each of these different environments via, edge. In computer science, they're called edge compute functions. Basically, edge processors plug into the APIs of each of your different environments. They will ingest the telemetry from these environments, provide them with context, kind of get rid of some of the temporal issues that you get with telemetry from different clouds, and then normalize them into a centralized relationship graph, which gives you a picture of your complete environment from end to end. So this isn't deploying, new agents or new infrastructure. We're plugging into the native controls you might have, the endpoint agents you might have, the SDNs you may have in your environment. And it allows you to deal with the challenge of all of this data. It turns it into information and knowledge, and then it provides you with a bunch of capabilities across the top in terms of visualization, reporting, policy management, which allows you to implement the security controls required. So a couple of use cases, or three very, very common use cases. First of all, operational and cyber risk management. So that's assessing the attack surface of your critical applications, or all of your applications, and looking at connected risk through dependency chains. The second one is isolation and segmentation, providing accurate and tested policy based around the dependencies of your applications, and also the control requirements of your organization, and assuring that they're managed and effective through the life cycle. And then finally, secure migration, effectively taking cloud migration and adoption projects as an opportunity to put in place controls, for instance, zero trust controls around your applications, and then monitor those controls and those policies across the life cycle of the application. So they're three very, very common use cases that our customers have. So I'm going to now quickly, and I'm conscious of the time, I think I've got another couple of minutes before we can go to Q&A. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our customer use cases to kind of to illustrate this for you. Cheers. So the first one here is a financial services institution in Asia, a very digital bank, highly digitized. They have a diverse multi-cloud in multiple cloud service providers. They're heavy users of Kubernetes and containers, but also they have, like many financial organizations, they have many traditional and legacy applications, particularly on the on the settlements and on the reporting side of the business. And what they have is, they have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, legacy, SDNs, and the vArmour application controller plugs into each of these environments and to the APIs within those environments to provide a central, consistent view across the entire organization. So we act as an agnostic controller management plane for risk assessments and policy management. And this promotes agility, and it reduces the complexity, because you're looking at your environment and your applications through a single pane of glass, and your people don't need to understand the intricacies of the differences between security groups in AWS, NSGs in Azure, how network policy works in Kubernetes. There's a single policy model that sits above them all. So that's a very, very powerful approach to simplify an extremely complex and an extremely challenging environment. So next, this is a bank in my part of the world, and the requirement here really initially was for application visibility and assurance. So this organization has coarse-grained segmentation, so they have segmentation between different realms of the environment and different major business units, but they had no visibility into the effectiveness of those policies and controls. They couldn't tell that they were working, and that's very common if you have SDNs. You'll have the ability to implement group-based policy, but actually all you get back are billions of logs and nothing that really describes to you the effectiveness of the policy and whether or not they're working. And that's important, particularly in regulated environments where you have to undergo audits. So the application controller, the vArmour product, measures policy efficacy, it reports and it optimizes policies, and it manages the life cycle of security policy in a very, very simple fashion. It also provides the understanding of application dependencies to facilitate things like effective business impact analyses and manage the kind of the granular zero trust policies that are required here. And again, we're plugging into SDNs, into firewalls, and into public cloud. So it's a very, very diverse environment. And then finally, we're going to talk about one of the largest service providers in the world, based in North America. And they're already one of the most advanced software-defined data center kind of infrastructure adopters on the planet. They have a high degree of security and zero trust segmentation within their private cloud, but they have an aggressive plan, or they had an aggressive plan, which we've worked with them on, to move to public cloud in a secure manner and improve their security posture as part of that project. So the role of the application controller here was to model dependencies, compute policies, test those policies, stage them, deploy them, and monitor them, and ensure that they're working all the way through the application lifecycle. Now, you've heard me say the word lifecycle over and over again in this talk, and that's one of the challenges for security these days. Applications do not stand still. And what application relationship management is designed to do is it allows you to keep your controls concurrent with the needs of your applications. So finally, application relationship management helps you deal with application and cloud complexity risk, and it allows you to address cyber resilience and operational risk requirements in environments where change is constant. It takes the capabilities of modern cloud and API-driven infrastructure and the data we can collect in this environment to drive accurate decisions about security policy and risk, and then continue to do so throughout the life cycle. So I guess I'm going to conclude with a question here. This technology began as a solution to complex cyber policy management challenges, and also the requirement to understand application dependencies. What we've since seen from our customers, they take this enriched set of knowledge to solve other problems. Things like business impact analysis, automation, understanding environmental dependencies, what's my dependency on a concentration risk on a given cloud provider, and to produce data flow diagrams for audits and compliance requirements. What's incredibly valuable to us is hearing from practitioners with real world challenges that this data set and approach can be applied to. So I'd love to have your feedback and your questions. So either now in this Q&A, or feel free to drop me an email. My email address is marc@vArmour.com. So thanks for your time. I think we have a little time for questions. In fact, I've actually finished dead on time, which makes a change. Okay. John, do we have any questions? Hello? Okay, well, Michelle, sorry, I didn't realize it was Montana. Greetings, Montana, from the UK. Is John Johnson there? Because I don't hear anybody. Well, I'm guessing. Okay, I'm guessing as there are no questions, then there are no questions. Well, thank you all very much for your time. And like I say, if any questions do come up, I'm marc@vArmour.com. Please feel free to drop me a line. And thanks for your time.